people think that because they have read the dictionary definition and they remember a dictionary definition of a word, that they know that word and they can use it and everything. And it's like, no. Like when I first came across this one, like in grad school, I was just like, what? That is insane. I think one of the big it's almost a misconception about language, I think, as much as it is a misunderstanding about learning, is that...
Benjamin Keep, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm super excited to have a conversation about the science of learning as it pertains to language learning. Can you explain for those who don't know or haven't heard of this idea of desirable difficulties, what it is?
Sure. So really, it's a label for a series, a bunch of phenomena that show the same pattern. And so let me take up one of those phenomena just to illustrate what the pattern is. So a simple example is when you have is what's called interleaving. Sorry, we talk about desirable difficulties. This is another word, interleaving. So, but this is a simple idea where say you're solving math problems and you are learning how to add and subtract and divide and multiply. Well, one way of doing that would be to kind of learn addition really well, and then learn subtraction really well, then learn multiplication really well, and then learn division really well. And this isn't the best example because that is kind of the progression of how you learn addition first. It's an easier concept. But if you are solving a bunch of problems of one type and you kind of learn that type really, really well, and then you solve the next type and learn that type really well. This is what's called blocking. So it's blocking because you've got a big block of questions, and then you've got another big block of questions and another big block of questions. And what happens is within this block, as you solve more and more, say, addition problems or say simple algebra problems, whatever, you get really better. You feel like you're getting a lot better at that. And then you start the next block and you feel like, man, I started out and I was struggling and now I'm a lot better because it's always the same problem.
Right.
But what happens is then you come to a test and you've got all kinds of problems mixed up together, or you come to a real life situation and you don't know what kind of problem you need to use and you need to actually come up with the right kind of problem and solve it. Well, now that blocked practice is kind of mismatched with what you're being asked to do. And because you've kind of felt like you really know what you're doing, but you haven't actually practiced the right skill, which I'm going to talk about in a second, this blocked practice has not been very beneficial to you. Now, the alternative, interleaving, which I mentioned before, would be to kind of randomize what problem you get next. So you don't know what problem is coming next. Now, typically, if you have students do solve a problem like that, or kind of go through a series of problems like that, then their performance is a lot worse than in the blocked situation. Because in the blocked situation, you know what's coming next, and you've kind of already got practice at it. It's kind of like, you've already hit a bunch of baseballs, and now like another baseball is coming in. You're not just suddenly playing tennis. But it turns out that the interleaved situation where you've got this randomized problems, it turns out that's more challenging now, so you do worse now. But then when you come to the test, you come to the realistic situation, you're actually a lot better prepared for it because it's testing the right kind of, there's a variety of reasons why that's true, but it's testing that one of the reasons is that it's testing the right kind of skill, because the skill is kind of figuring out what the problem needs and how to solve the problem. It's not just kind of getting good in addition and getting good at multiplication, getting good at division. It's looking at the problem and understanding the problem. And the interleaved situation kind of, it prevents you from just kind of not thinking and doing, I'm just doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
So the interleaved situation, you're like, hold up, okay, wait, this is something new, I got to do this. Oh wait, is this the same? Is this different? So there's lots of that cognitive work going on, which is beneficial in the long run. So this is one example of a desirable difficulty, and there are other examples. And what this guy Robert Bjork, who's a very famous memory researcher, discovered, a learning researcher, he discovered, or he kind of coined this term desirable difficulties, because you kept finding things like this. You kept finding things like interleaving, that it's like, hey, this is harder now, then students get better later. And you have to distinguish between a short-term test, or like kind of a short-term performance kind of thing, and a longer-term test or longer-term kind of task that people are performing later on. And it's where you see the benefits is in the long term.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, no. Again, you just opened up a can of worms. I have so many questions now. Maybe I'll start with this one. Okay, so you mentioned the idea of interleaving versus mass practice. Is it fair to call it mass practice, or like, or sorry, what was the other term you used? Like
So
chunking or
there's a bunch of different stuff that so there's interleaving and what's called block practice
blocked. Oh, sorry, blocked
is the
practice.
contrast, and then
Right.
spaced practice versus mass practice is another contrast. So spaced practice is when you're practicing for the same amount of time, but you're just adding some breaks in between. And mass practice is like,
Right.
nah, I'm not adding any breaks. I'm just kind of doing it all in the same day or something like that.
Right. My question is, I'm curious if you have any sense of whether doing the mass practice or the blocked practice, if there's any benefit to that early on when you're first learning, or even in that encoding phase, which is another term that I guess we have to explain. But the reason I'm asking is because when I started learning Chinese, what I found was that when my level was very, very low, I felt like I had to it was very difficult for me too. And maybe this is a blind spot. Maybe the fact that it was difficult was necessary. But I'm curious whether I needed to do a lot of that repetition and the mass practice and the block practice first in order to get into the more desirable practice, like the interleaving and the. So I guess I'm asking, is there ever a time when maybe mass practice and block practice early on is important?
Yes, that's a good question. So I can speak to blocked practice in particular, and it's always challenging. I guess I should have said this in the outset. You know, we're eventually, I think we're going to be talking about language learning more, but it's challenging talking some of these learning principles. It's like a lot of the research has been done in only one area. So, interleaving has been done in lots of different tasks, and so it seems like a universal, even like sports skills. So this is a kind of universal phenomenon, but I will say that what I'm about to say is most strongly represented in the mathematics literature. And so how much does that translate into the language learning literature, or the language learning idea? I have not read specific pieces that talk about this in language learning. So we need to always keep in mind, like, be a little bit like, not I mean, a little healthily skeptical. Like don't disbelieve it at all, but I would say my opinion at the moment, pending other research, would be that yes, it is beneficial in the beginning to have blocked practice. And so, and actually, there's kind of a trade-off here. I mean, I talk in the videos about interleaved practice being better, and that is a very general statement that is true. But what blocked practice and interleaved practice are asking your brain to do, is different things. And so, interleaved practice is generally speaking better when you are trying to understand the differences between things. So if you're learning about a bunch of different painting styles, or you're learning about a bunch of different birds, and you want to be able to distinguish different bird species from each other, that's an interleaved kind of situation. But when you're at the beginning of learning something, sometimes you really want to understand the similarities between something. You want to kind of fix something in your head first before we start attacking it and kind of making it more challenging. And so the standard recommendation that comes from researchers in the mathematics field is that maybe for the first third of the work that you're going to have students do, have it be blocked, or maybe the first quarter. But exactly when you move into this more challenging thing is a question, but you do want to move into an interleave situation quickly. You don't want to stay forever in this kind of blocked situation. I mean, that's true in general in a lot of learning situations. It's very easy to be like, okay, I'm doing this practice and I'm just going to keep doing this practice, but you kind of always need to make your practice more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And especially, I will say this with language learning, just from personal experience, it is very easy to kind of rest, because languages can be really hard, and you know after a while your brain can hurt or you're kind of so confused or befuddled,
Right.
and so it's easy to just be like, I'm just going to do the thing. I'm at a good level. I'm just going to do my thing. But to reach higher levels, you kind of always need to be challenging yourself, and interleaving is just a specific case of that.
Right. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. The other question I had was within the different types of desirable difficulties, and I guess we can maybe quickly list them out. So there's interleaving, there's spacing that you mentioned, which is like spacing your practice between different times, and then there's contextual variation. Is that one? And then testing.
Yes,
and
I would say those are the kind of the classic ones. Yeah,
those are the classic ones. Yeah. Are you aware that if any one of those are more effective than the other ones? Like, for for example, if you had to pick one only or you had to focus on one of them, like, would you say, or are they equally as effective?
If I had to focus on one of them, I mean, testing has a lot of other benefits. Like it helps you diagnose your own learning and understand where you are to make kind of your future studying or your future practice more effective. So that has a very good extra benefits, I would say. Contextual variation, a lot of the research. So the research has been mostly on. I mean, there's been a lot of research on spacing and a lot of research on interleaving. It's the kind of stuff that it's relatively, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to design a laboratory study to test. But contextual variation is one of these things that people do not tend to appreciate or realize how absurdly critical it is. And I don't know, there's one of my older videos, I don't know if you've seen this one, but is on throwing bean bags. It's a report on a study. This study is from like the 70s. But basically, you have a bunch of kids learn how to like play cornhole, where you throw bean bags through a hole. And the researcher, this is a sports researcher. He gave one group of kids, he had them do it like at 3 feet, like 3 feet distance. You know, you're throwing these bean bags 3 feet. And another group of kids, he had them throwing it at I think like 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet. So like the same amount of practice, same amount of time, same amount of throws, same kind of feedback, everything like that. All you've done is just change like the variety of practice that they're doing. And then he tested everyone at 3 feet. So he tested everyone at the one where the group had gotten so much practice doing. And it was actually the group that threw less at 3 feet, that threw more varieties of distances, that performed better than the group that threw at 3 feet. Which, like, when I first came across this one, like in grad school, I was just like, what? That is insane. But actually, that is the normal thing that happens. That is, you talk about free throws. That is if you can practice, like if you and your friend are both training to become really good free throw shooters, the better thing to do is to not always throw at the free throw line, but to throw a little bit closer, a little bit further away, a little bit to the side. Like adding that variation into the practice it's been demonstrated in free throws. It's been demonstrated in so many different things, so many different areas. But it is really underappreciated how important that is, because in our minds it makes so much sense that it's like I should just practice the thing that I'm supposed to do, right? Like
Right.
that makes so much sense to us.
Right.
So
that's so counterintuitive, but it kind of makes sense, but it's not something that you would intuitively think of.
Yes.
That's very interesting. So this leads me to another question about this idea of encoding and retrieval. So I first learned about this through your video as well, and I think you showed in one of your videos, it was very well done. You showed a graph of I guess maybe we can explain what encoding is. Maybe if you can explain what encoding is, and then talk about that graph that you showed comparing encoding and retrieval, because
Sure.
I was a bit confused because
this is one of those things I should have explained it better, Dan. See?
It sounded like based on your video, it sounded like retrieval is more effective than encoding. But then the way you ended the video, it was like, well, but you can also do both of them.
You should
so
do both.
yeah, so I'm just curious, like, if you could elaborate on that, and if you really had to,
Okay.
if you had limited time, like which one would you focus on?
Both. Yeah, sorry. So let me maybe I can make it more clear now. I'm not sure. So encoding and retrieval are cognitive processes that our brain engages in whenever we're learning. So and these are kind of names for like kind of systems of processes really that are happening in our brain. And so encoding is what happens when we are first learning something new. So we're reading something if whoever is listening to this podcast right now, any information, anything that you're gleaning from it, anything that you're trying to remember for later, you are encoding, or at least, you are encoding. Whether it's good encoding or bad encoding is another question. And how well we've encoded something influences how well we can remember something later. And then the other process that happens is when we go to remember something later, that's called retrieval. So we go to our long-term memory and we pull something back out again. And so it might make sense if we're just talking about this, it might make sense. Well, like the encoding, how you kind of think about things originally, how you put something, it's let's make an analogy to kind of putting something on a shelf. It's like, hey, you put something in the right drawer or in the right place where you know where it is, and that makes it easy to retrieve again. So maybe encoding is really important. Maybe like figuring out where to put it is very important, and it is important. It is important. But it and retrieving is kind of not that interesting because it's just like you just go to the shelf and you take it off. Like what are you doing? And if you can't find it, if you didn't encode it well, you're still just kind of searching around, and then when you grab it, you find it. That's it. But what happens because our brains are amazing, the retrieval process is also a process of transformation. So every time, and the maybe the best example of this is with eyewitness memory. So when someone they see a crime or something like that, and you ask them, hey, what did you see? What happened? If you keep asking them this question over and over again, well, first of all, their memory is probably not that great for it. But the reason why their memory is not that great for it is mostly because of interference after the fact, of retrieval processes that happen that kind of change the memory. So every time you pull the memory back out again, it's kind of being transformed and changed. And so there's a kind of an academic term for this where it's like retrieval is a memory modifier. So retrieval is changing the strength of the memories, changing what the memories are in some cases. And it's amazing because that lets us be flexible. That lets us, like, we remember something, but we can modify and change and connect it to different things. So it's not, things aren't just fixed in our brain all the time. Now the graph that you saw in this video was really a graph not of these two cognitive processes, but on study techniques that leverage these processes. So there's what's called elaborative encoding, or kind of maybe your listeners have heard of what's called concept maps, or sometimes called mind mappings. I mean, there are important differences between these things, but for our purposes, they're the same. For this conversation at the moment, they're the same. And the idea is that you kind of lay out your ideas in a map and kind of understand the interrelationships between different ideas. And you can do this poorly, you can do this well, so I do want to say that. But basically, these researchers tested, like, hey, if I just ask people, like, the goal is to remember stuff in this particular study. And a lot of learning relies on memory, even though there's other things going on too. And so if I just ask people, like, hey, I'm asking everyone to remember the material from this passage. And one group, I have them make this map. So they're looking at this passage and they're trying to organize it and make sense of it. And the other group, I give them this passage, then I take away the passage and I ask them to remember everything they can remember. Just write down everything you can remember on a blank text file. And then I give them the passage back again to make any last correction. I think that was the setup for that particular experiment. Anyhow, between the two groups, the group that's doing this elaborative mapping, so they have the passage in front of them, they're going back and forth, ideally between the passage and the mapping and the encoding. They really don't remember very well compared to the group that is just asked, hey, just tell me everything you remember about this. It's not even in an organized way necessarily. I mean, they're just writing down random thoughts on a blank text file. And there's multiple study. I mean, that particular study is a very stark look. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers offhand, but it's something like, twice as effective, or maybe even slightly more than that, in terms of the amount of things that people remembered using a retrieval-based study technique versus an elaborative encoding study technique. Now, I want to qualify that because a lot of people, right, and a lot of people in the comments, they're making good points about how it's like, hey, like, maybe this elaborative encoding technique really wasn't the best thing to do. Maybe, there are various ways you can do it. There are various other tests you can do. One thing that makes retrieval-based study techniques, like that's called free recall, what I just described, where you have a blank sheet of paper or a blank text file, and you're just like, hey, just sit down and remember everything. One thing that makes them appealing is their simplicity. You don't have to learn to do anything to do it. You literally just have to write stuff down and remember it. And I mean, I talk a little bit more. I mean, I think it's better if you can sit down and start to organize what you're remembering. But yeah, it it's one kind of retrieval-based study technique. I mean, flashcards are another kind of retrieval-based study technique. And there are different kinds of, we encode, the complexities of encoding are maybe even more interesting, and I can talk about those as well. But there are a wide variety of effective, kind of more effective encoding techniques and less effective encoding techniques in the abstract, in the these kind of laboratory tasks that they ask people to do. But you really, it's not. You do have to choose what study techniques you use. So in that sense, there are certain trade-offs in terms of your time. But you have to encode stuff originally to be able to retrieve anything. So
Right.
I mean, it's kind of like these are partners in crime. They're working together, and often self-testing practices can lead to more effective encoding practices because you realize, hey, whatever I did last time, I did not do it very well. I didn't encode it very well because I'm having trouble retrieving it again. I'm having trouble remembering it. And so yeah, I also encourage people to experiment with encoding methods. I mean, in the language learning realm, there are, some people use visualization stuff or like the mnemonic techniques, like the memory
Right.
kind of memory palace techniques.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've experimented with this stuff in language learning at all.
No, I haven't.
But yeah, like there's a wide variety of techniques that are helpful. Even what's called generation. I feel like now I'm just throwing stuff at the wall, but generation is something where you are trying to remember the appropriate word or the appropriate idea in like looking at the total context of stuff. So it's like if you were reading a sentence in Chinese or something and it was missing a word and you had to work to like figure out what that word means, or even in normal reading where it's like there's a word that you don't know the meaning of and you have to figure out from context what that word means. Like that is a very powerful encoding, not exactly a technique, I guess, like kind of practice that you're going to remember that word probably quite a bit more effectively than if you just were told what that word is.
Right. That's so interesting. Right. But I'm still kind of confused because from from that study, it seems like retrieval, like you said, is still much better, even when they don't do any extravagant or fancy encoding techniques. So would you say that, someone who's not doing these memory palace things, or from my experience, I've never done anything like that. I would say, looking back, I feel like me not knowing the research very well, I would say my encoding was not very sophisticated, and I would say most of my learning was based off of retrieval. So yeah, I'm just curious, like if I had added more encoding, whether that would have helped me more if I had done all these other things, like, or whether it was a good idea that I stuck more to retrieval practices.
I think what you did sounds okay. I mean, where I think encoding can be helpful in language learning, for instance, is that I don't know if you use flashcards. I've used flashcards a fair amount, especially when learning Chinese in the beginning. And over time, I kind of stopped using them. And I think they still can be useful in the beginning, just to kind of get a bank of words in your head that I mean, we can talk about flashcards more later, but the problem is that I think people kind of overuse and over rely on them and think that they understand the word or the meaning of the word just from using flashcards, where really it's kind of just the beginning of the process, or it's kind of like a very low level knowledge. But if you've ever had this experience where I'll just tell this story. So I remember when I was first learning Chinese, I was like writing down everything I saw in a flashcard, not everything, but like when I was being ambitious, I would write down things I saw in a flashcard app. And there was a woman standing in front of me in line in Taiwan, and she had the Jidu Yesu on her like baseball cap or something. And I knew none of these characters.
Right.
And I did not know what that meant. I mean, I had to like look up the words, and it's Jesus Christ.
Right.
And now I don't have any occasion to discuss Jesus in Chinese with other people. Maybe if I was, kind of a devoted Christian or something living in Taiwan and I met people in the community, maybe that word would mean a lot to me. But because I was being stupidly ambitious and I wasn't making a good decision, I put that into my flashcard app. And so every freaking time that came around, I would not understand it, not remember how to write it. These were all characters that I didn't know. I knew little parts of it, but it's that kind of thing where when you've had that feeling where it's like a flashcard has come up and you're just like, oh man, this is the 10th time I'm looking at this over the past couple months and I always forget it. More retrieval is not going to help you. Right? Like, it's a sign, that's a good sign that there's something here that it's disconnected, it's floating in kind of the ether here for you.
Right.
And so what you need to do is you need to connect it with things that you know in some way, or find some other way of remembering it through mnemonic techniques or something to help make it sticky. And this is, I don't know, do you know the app Pleco, the dictionary app?
I use it all the time. Yeah.
Adore it.
It's amazing.
I cannot believe how good it is. And simple, and there's a lot of features I don't even use, but
and free. So many connections too. Yeah.
Amazing. So, but something that I tend to do, and you can tell me if you do the same, I don't know. I have a new character, a new word or something. Maybe it's a new word that I know maybe one of the characters of, and I don't know the other one very well. And so then I look at that character, because you can just click, okay, I'm going to look at that character and the meaning for that character. And then I look at the related words for that character. And so now I'm not going to remember all of these words that I'm reading, right? That's not the goal. But just to get a flavor for like, okay, what is this character used? What kind of words is it being used for? And what are related, words? And sometimes there's something that's like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that before. And so that is a kind of something that is more focused on encoding practice, right? Like, I'm just reading things, but I'm trying to understand the relationships of things and trying to make meaning from the stuff that I'm looking at, instead of just being like, hey, this is a block, and I just got to remember this block, and that's it. And it's chair is silla in Spanish or whatever, and I just have to remember that. And there are lots of things like that, and especially in the beginning, it feels like that. But I mean, in everything really that we learned, but especially in languages are systems.
Right.
And so, and finding patterns, getting a feel for those patterns. And so that I think is an elaborative, would be a case of like, that's an encoding practice that I think is quite helpful and useful and necessary to be kind of efficient and effective, and not something I've always done for sure. But
yeah, now that you bring that up, I've realized that maybe my understanding of encoding was very superficial. Now I realize, yeah, I've actually done a lot of encoding, like just unintentionally. Like, now that you bring that up, I used to do that all the time in Pleco, where I would look at the same thing, like what you said, like look at a character and then look at the radicals and look at the related characters that use the same radicals, or like different words that contain the same character. I would do that all the time. And I'm curious whether, because I used to also try my best to listen to things in context, so like natural conversations or podcasts, versus just learning a word isolated. And I'm curious whether you would say that is that enhances encoding because you're listening in context.
Yes, 100%. I think one of the big it's almost a misconception about language, I think, as much as it is a misunderstanding about learning, is that, and this comes up in the literature on language learning too. So there's this idea, right? We have grammar, we have vocabulary, and grammar are the structures, and we fit the vocabulary in, and the vocabulary are just these kind of words, and you grow your vocabulary and you grow your grammatical structures, and then we just kind of mix and match. And there's some truth to that, but the idea that has been, I mean, even as early as the 80s, I think people were writing about this, but is something called Lexus, which is my understanding is that this is basically a fancy term for patterns in the language. And so it's like there are certain, like, and these can come up in different ways. One of the ways is these idiomatic, expressions, the chengyu, or these kind of like common set phrases that people use. And what, my reading of the language learning literature suggests that it's, these are very, like the consensus is that native speakers, they aren't doing these individual vocabulary words all the time. They're using these chunks to explain things. Even right now, I'm reflecting, I'm like, oh man, I'm probably using these certain ideas, certain kind of patterns over and over again when we speak, when we write. And this also includes things like what's called collocation. So that just means like words that are next to each other or words that are commonly used with one another. So you were a family doctor, right? So it's like stuff that is in medicine. There are certain words that like you don't use them when you're eating breakfast. Okay, you use them when you're talking to a patient. They're just and language is just full of that stuff. And so given the context, given the situation, given the other words that are nearby, given the pattern that's being spoken, that is really the vocabulary word. Like in my view, it's kind of like the words being used in context and with each other. I mean, you can use, like, it is another idea that comes up because people think that because they have read the dictionary definition and they remember a dictionary definition of a word, that they know that word and that's like part, they can use it and everything. And it's like, no. That is almost like the flashcards. Like that's the beginning of understanding the word. But the word is not given, I feel like I'm some sort of philosophy teacher now, but the word is not, that's not really what the word is. The word is all of the situations that it's used in and when it's used appropriately. And so for me, it's far, like when I think about learning vocabulary, and again, I haven't had a lot of time lately to work on this, but I've been thinking more about, it's like seeing example sentences. And this is one of the reasons why I think listening to native, what you were talking about, usually people talk about it in the context of comprehensible input, right? Like you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to, or you're reading something that you can understand at least some of and maybe most of, but you're seeing words in different contexts and different patterns and everything like that. Seeing examples is a far more powerful way for me of learning vocabulary than reading definitions and learning definitions.
100% agree. Yeah, so, man, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but we're running almost into an hour.
We can do another episode if you wanted to.
Yeah,
but,
I feel like we need to do a part 2. But I feel like if there's one other topic I want to bring up, it's the one that you brought up. If we maybe go into the language learning realm a little bit, this idea of what's very commonly brought up in language learning is this idea of input and output. And and I've also heard, before we get into that, like you brought up this idea of comprehensible input, which is popularized and is a theory by Dr. Stephen Krashen, which is very popular in the language learning community. And then I was surprised to find recently that there's also a lot of other different theories. Like, for example, there's this theory, like the comprehensible output theory that I found out recently that by Merrill Swain that I didn't know about. But so this is a very interesting topic because for a long time I was very much a proponent of comprehensible input, and not to say that I don't think it works. I actually think it was very helpful for me. But what I realized looking back in my language learning journey was that when I started outputting outputting more, when I came to Taiwan and started speaking with a lot of the natives, started making friends, doing language exchanges, that's when I noticed I was making a lot of improvements and progress and learning a lot more. So I don't know if that was coincidence, but in my mind, like, kind of looking back, that's sort of my experience. And also like seeing other language learners, I've also seen similar patterns, and so I'm curious what you think about that in the context of like the science of learning, and just to throw that out, like I also saw a video by Dr. Bork. I think it's Robert Bjork. Is that his name?
I don't know. I pronounce it Bjork. I've never met. I mean, he's passed away now. Actually, his wife is still alive. His wife is also an amazing researcher, Elizabeth Bjork. That's how I pronounce the last name. Maybe it's just Bork. I'm not exactly sure.
Right. Sorry to butcher his name. But anyways, so I saw a video I think I shared with you where he actually recommends less input and more output, but he was obviously talking about in general the learning, but probably not specifically to languages. But I'm curious. Sorry for sharing all that, but I'm curious if you have any ideas on that.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts. I would say I'm still kind of poring over some of the language learning literature literature. Because I get asked about it frequently, and I do have some language learning experience, not as much as maybe you or maybe some other people, but it's always been interesting to me because I've never really known what the right thing to do is. With respect to Robert Bjork's like talking about input and output, he was definitely talking about it like in the context of especially of college and school systems where where a lot of the studying is like, I am going to read more, I'm going to listen to this lecture again, I am going to kind of be keep that the problem is that I don't have enough information in me, and so I just keep plugging information in, and so yeah, I don't think he was thinking about it in terms of the language learning situation, and I don't think he actually even I don't know to what degree he even engaged with the people who are studying language learning. That said, so as it relates to kind of comprehensible input, comprehensible output, and various other theories, there's a book I just finished reading called like How We Learn Languages or something. It's an academic book, but it's directed towards foreign language teachers. And one of the stories, I can give you the citation afterwards if you want to put it in the description or something. It's a pretty solid book. It's a little bit, in my opinion, they rely a little bit too much on kind of on kind of understanding theoretical ideas, but they have a lot of kind of just like, hey, here's a description of a study, like this is what happened. And one of the stories in there is from a first this is a native speaker kind of story, but it sheds light, I think, on this input-output idea. And unfortunately, this kid was raised only watching TV. No one spoke to him. And when the CPS or whoever got a hold of him, he had a lot of challenges with forming kind of correct sentences and with communicating effectively and everything like that. And eventually, through interaction with other people, he got over them. So I don't know how many years it took him. I don't know, maybe a couple of years or something like that. But he had a younger brother who was in the same situation, and who grew up speaking to his older brother as well, like not just watching TV, but just having that extra person to speak with. And this younger brother didn't have any problems at all. And so there's something about interacting and speaking to other people that is very, very important. And I think that there's actually, there's some people who have kind of taken Stephen Krashen's idea and kind of expanded it or complicated it a little bit in different ways. And one of these ideas, and I forget the researcher's name right now, I feel bad. But this guy basically, he was kind of like, I agree with the idea of comprehensible input, but the question is, how do you actually make things comprehensible? And one of the ways is that you negotiate meaning with other people, right? If someone says something that's too complicated and you get a little piece of it, and you ask them, hey, what did you mean by this? Or oh, do you mean this thing? Or the various ways we all in this whole conversation, right? You've asked me some questions, I've said some things, maybe I've asked you some questions. So we're kind of negotiating the meaning of what we're trying to say. And so we're trying to make it, you want to make yourself heard and I want to make myself understood and heard. So it's kind of like we would modify our language if I felt like, oh, hey, I don't know if Dan's getting this, I'll try to modify my language or you would change what you would say to me. And so it's like those interactions that he was saying, that's really where the kind of comprehensible, where you get like the most comprehensible of inputs, right? And you're kind of moving in this space of more complicated utterances, more simple utterances, different ways of saying the same thing. And it's all in a context, in a meaningful context, presumably to actually share like real meaning, right? Which, one of the things that Stephen Krashen, I think he was right about a lot of things, I think. But, the typical grammatical instruction and even a lot of the exercises in school are not, they are kind of like simulations of actual languages. Right. It's kind of like we're not actually. I'm not actually a salesperson selling you cookies, and you're not actually here buying something. We're kind of pretending. And we have this form that we're supposed to follow, and we're just kind of, but we're not actually trying to express ourselves in any kind of meaningful way. Right. Not that I think pretend play can be a really powerful language learning technique. I don't want to get into that, but the idea that the real meaning meaning, like expressing meaning in kind of real time and understanding other people's meaning, I think is a very important thing. And so I think with comprehensible input, the problem, I mean, there are various limitations to it. One is that you never really get to see what isn't acceptable. So you get to read positive cases, right? Like you're always reading something that's grammatical or listening to something that's
Right.
like native like. But what that tends to that helps you see what is permissible, but it doesn't help you see what is not permissible or what is not
Right.
acceptable or what is not
Right.
appropriate. And so that's up to you sometimes to put your foot in your mouth and say something that's wrong, because you're trying to express something. And so a lot of times more direct instruction can support, I think, comprehensible input. Sometimes directed feedback can support comprehensible input. I think, and I think that this idea of outputting and especially negotiating meaning, like I think you can have kind of I think there are more people that say that they really believe in comprehensible input that really understand what that means, because it's so easy for us to trick ourselves into thinking, like I swear, maybe I'm just a way overly optimistic person, but you will catch me if you went back in the record of my life and different languages that I've tried to learn at various times, you would definitely catch me saying like, oh yeah, I remember, I understood like 60% of that, and I understood like 20% of that or 10% of that even. It's just so easy to trick yourself to think that
Right.
you kind of get something because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And the people who are doing like hey, I'm watching movies in this target language, and it's like, or listening to podcasts sometimes, it's like sometimes I listen to podcasts in English and I'm just not even paying attention to them, like they're just
Right.
passing over my head. And so the important part is that you are actually doing the cognitive work to understand what is being said, and
Right.
finding the appropriate level for that is hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it's important. Comprehensible input is really important, but there are
Right.
other things going on as well that are important to do.
Oh man, you just brought up another thing that I want to ask you about. But yeah, I totally agree. I think comprehensible input is super important. I'll bring up, I'll just quickly share another, like, I guess, story that you might find interesting. It kind of relates to the story that you brought up of in the language book that you read. Because I grew up listening to my parents speak Cantonese, and I found a very similar experience where right now I can understand a lot more than I can speak. My speaking is very, very poor, and so I probably sound like a toddler when I speak, but when I listen, I can completely, like, probably 80% understand what they're talking about. But yeah, in terms of speaking, it's almost like a completely different skill for me. So unless I actually practice it, I can barely speak. So that's the other thing that kind of makes me think that there's sort of different skills in that aspect. And then the other thing is,
For sure.
I mean, yeah, the thing when I think about input and output in the context of like the language science that you've presented, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like when you're outputting, you're also engaging in a lot more retrieval practices, like you have to actually actively think about and draw from what you've learned. So you're engaging in like contextual variation if you're talking to people in different contexts, or perhaps like testing. Well, I guess it's a form of testing because you have to like actually speak. Like when you're listening, I guess you're just, or reading, you're just consuming, I guess, more, but you don't have to actively produce it. So yeah, I'm curious whether you think that's true, or whether they both are engaging in retrieval practices, or whether, yeah, I'm curious what you think about that.
So I mean, there's to some degree, even like reading is for me, and this is more based on personal experience than anything. I find it's hard for me to read a foreign language passively. Like I can kind of read over English and just kind of go over it, but because it's like I don't understand anything if I'm not actively like
Right.
really actively engaged, at least when you're at the intermediate levels. Maybe when you get to the super high levels, you're kind of like, it becomes almost more native like. But it's like, for me at least, like reading in a foreign language, it demands attention. I cannot do it unless I'm really actively thinking about it. But there's something that, and I wish we had like a language learning expert here to comment on this, because I do think there's something in what you are saying in terms of like the practice that, and I mean, you can always go back to this kind of, am I practicing the skill that I actually am trying to get better at? And to some degree, like reading and speaking or listening and speaking and writing. They're all like connected skills, but
Right.
they're not all the same. I mean, I had a friend of my brother's who lived in China for many years. Like, she spoke fluently and could not read. It's like if you care about speaking like that, you can just go down that road, and it's okay. And the thing with that you are doing when you are in conversation with someone else, when you are speaking, when you are talking to someone, is that you are kind of creating your own sentence. I mean, there's an amazing amount of literature about how inventive people can be with language, right? And that, I mean, very quickly, very early on, kids are combining words in ways that they have never heard before, right?
Mm.
And so that aspect to it, to me, feels very, very important, because unless you are spending that time getting that practice in terms of yeah, using things in new. I mean, I don't know how many times you have put your foot in your mouth with Mandarin, but I have like said so many wrong things, or kind of, I mean, I
Same.
still say lots of wrong things all the time, where you're trying out something that seems to make sense to you, but maybe, because of the patterns in the language, because of the Lexus, it doesn't, that doesn't fit there for whatever reason. But you didn't know that, so you're trying it out, and maybe you get a weird look, and you're like, oh, maybe that wasn't the best thing to say, or maybe they repeat what you should have said to you, and you're kind of like, oh, maybe that's what I should use from now on. Or just the act of, I mean, beyond the feedback, just the act of putting the pieces together and coming up with something new. I mean, I find even like, I always hated doing, I went to like a one-on-one kind of course, and we would go like once a week. I would see this excellent teacher, and she would, we were working from this book sometimes, and they would have essays in it, and like, she wasn't going to make me do any work. And so because it's like, I'm paying this one-on-one course, I can just do whatever I want. So we would have conversations, and occasionally I would do the workbook, and I never wanted to do the essays, but then actually when I wrote the essays, I was like, this is really helpful, because
Right.
it's the combination. And this is another thing where you learn in kind of a traditional language learning setting, you learn these grammatical structures. They're kind of like, this is used like that, here's some examples, try it out. This is used like that, try some, here's some examples, try it out. And so you're always just kind of like, you have these pieces, but putting the pieces together in a way that feels natural to you and expresses what you want to say, that is completely different. Combining sentence patterns together with, words, with ideas, maybe words you just learned right then that you're testing out, whatever it is, that is completely different for me. And that is a very important part of learning the language. I don't think you can't just say you've learned the language if you haven't, as you say,
Right.
like, if you don't regularly speak and talk to someone.
Right. Yeah, it's so fascinating.
That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, yeah. Wow. Yeah, like I said, there's so many more questions I want to ask you, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. We've already gone over an hour, but maybe one last thing is, if people want to find out more about you, Ben, where should they go? Do you have something that you want to share?
Sure. So you can go to my website. It's just my name, www.benjaminkeep.com. I have a YouTube channel, which I haven't posted videos in lately, but I will be. I am kind of on the crest of should be in the next months, posting more regularly, quite a bit regularly there. Again, that's just under my name, so you can just look up Benjamin Keep on YouTube. That's about it. I don't really have much other social media, but I am pretty active on answering comments, usually on YouTube. I have an email, so on my website you can sign up to an email list. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm extremely grateful, and I'd be happy to come back on, just because I felt like our conversation was so interesting and good. And I don't know if people give feedback to you on the podcast, or people write comments to you, but if people have questions, I am always happy to give my opinions about things. I'm not saying they're right, but I am happy to pontificate, as it were. So
Right.
so go nuts. Yeah, if anyone has any questions and you want me to answer them, I'm happy to do that.